my lovelies, welcome back. Today's case is one that's going to leave, I think, some people conflicted. I think that one of the things in the UK about our police officers is that they don't, on the whole, carry guns. They do have certain weapons, but for the most part, guns are not carried. We do have armed officers, as I've noted. But because of that, there are very few deaths in the UK which involve an officer shooting an individual that they may consider a perpetrator or somebody resisting arrest. Obviously in the States, it's a very different matter. People do routinely carry guns in America and the police are armed. And that obviously means there's going to be a higher incidence of police killing potential perpetrators or people they think are resisting in some way, being arrested. And today's case is going to highlight one of those. The reason I'm going to say that some people are going to be conflicted is that I do know that a lot of people have some very strong views on the rights of police officers doing their job, and that at times people being tried for murder, for example, as a police officer when they have been in their line of duty, that does cause some people conflict because they feel that that isn't necessarily that fair. They're there to serve and protect. They're only doing their best, and in these circumstances, accidents happen. But for me, from the outside looking in, as an English person, I can absolutely see why it's absolutely essential to hold police officers to the highest of account when it comes down to the loss of life. And that's not because we are thinking that the person that they may have killed is some innocent individual. It's because we have to believe that you are innocent until proven guilty. And so even if somebody is being arrested and maybe resisting that arrest, they're still innocent until proven guilty and should be treated that way. And also the idea that there is never another way than to actually kill a suspect is something that takes my breath away, because that absolutely is. That noted, I do appreciate some people are going to watch this video and come down on the side of the officer. I am going to try and be really neutral at the same time, because like I said, I'm coming from this from a cultural position of not understanding what it's like in the States. It's as simple as that. And I appreciate, therefore, that people who live in the United States are going to have potentially different views from me, and actually more of an educated view than me. So please do, as ever, leave your comments for me to read and peruse so that I can be educated and understand more a cultural perspective from the United States. Also, to those of you new to my channel, I release my crime content deep dives here twice weekly. They are always going to be here ad infinitum till I take my last breath. So if you love crime content and you haven't subscribed yet, why don't you get your notifications on so you never miss an episode? Also, to every single one of you who's enjoying my full-length content that goes out on Patreon and YouTube membership, because of you I get to do these videos consistently and I can't do it without you. So literally the biggest amount of thanks to each and every one of you. And if you like my stuff and you want more of it, you can go there, sign up, and you can get more of my full-length content. And there is more and more coming out because I am obsessed with true crime and I'm obsessed with telling the stories of victims with respect. And today's case is certainly going to be no different to that. And also, before I kick off with today's true crime video, why don't you give me a like if you do like my content? Apparently it's good for the algorithm and it means that I'll get seen by more people, and I would love to grow my channel more. Also, you will note I'm quite summery, and in the UK where I live, it isn't summery, it's super wintry, but that's because I'm working out in Thailand at the moment and also at the same time visiting my youngest son who fights here. So please accept my apologies for me not having the biggest crime background right now. Full service will resume in the normal manner when I get back to the UK at the end of the month. So let's talk about today's true crime case. We're going to talk about the very sad death of Patrick Lyoya. He was a 26-year-old Congolese refugee who, as I've already alluded to, was killed by a police officer. Now, that has been seen as a very cold-blooded killing. I'll make that clear now. I have watched this play out on camera, and like I said, I'm going to try to reserve my judgments for the most part, but also I'm going to play the footage so that you can get a feel for it yourself. Because one of the most amazing things about today, and people love it and hate it, is CCTV and home CCTV. I have it myself. Don't try to leave me a delivery and then steal it, because if you do, I'm coming for you. I've got my CCTV. If you say you've dropped something off and you haven't, I'm coming for you. I've got my CCTV. And I know that some people struggle with that because it also is an invasion of privacy for certain people. But for the most part, it does mean that we see crimes play out in actual real time. And it doesn't matter whether body cam footage disappears or goes off. People are recording it literally with their doorbells. And absolutely, this case is testament to that. And just before I go into the details about Patrick Lyoya, One of the things I want to do is be really honest. So I'm not going to play the politically correct card. I'm not going to do the whole George Floyd, he was an amazing guy type rhetoric. I'm not going to do it. What happened to George Floyd was awful. It was terrible. It shouldn't have happened. He wasn't a great guy. Sorry. I don't care about statues being put up to him. He was not a great guy. Does that mean he should have died? Absolutely not. Likewise, I'm not going to put Patrick Lyoya in a light where he's some kind of a beacon of community life. He wasn't. But that's why we also have to be very clear. No matter who you are and where you come from, no matter your background and history, no matter your economic climate in your life, no one has a right, no matter what you are doing, in my opinion, to take your life unless that person is legally allowed to and is in genuine danger from you. So for me, I'm starting this video very clearly putting out what my beliefs are, which is it is okay to have conversations about people who are not necessarily the most pro-social individuals and might have done things that are really not great at all and we might not respect, but they still have a right to life. Not all people. We all know my views on certain individuals. I don't think everybody does have a right to life, but I certainly think that Patrick Lyoya does. So let's talk about, first of all, his difficult start. He was a refugee from the eastern region of the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'm sure most of you are aware of some of the stuff that's happened out in the Congo, but it is absolutely terrifying what people who live there have been through. Not everybody, I appreciate this is not a blanket statement, but those affected by what has happened out there, it is absolutely traumatic beyond belief. The death camps, the rape, the murder, it is beyond most people's comprehension. We live in the Western world, in a relatively safe world. That's why I cover cases like this, because it blows our minds when people are murdered or killed in situations that they shouldn't have been murdered or killed. Likewise, there are people right now in this very moment that I'm speaking going through the most abhorrent experiences, the most terrifying experiences, and their lives are not valued in the way that they should be valued. So it's a difficult place for him to be born. His dad was Peter, mother Dorothy, and his early life was just genuinely marked by all the challenges and hardships that actually many people face in Central America. There's a hell of a lot of political instability, huge amount of poverty, massive issues around personal safety. And he actually ended up living his early life right into his adolescence in refugee camps in the DRC. So he experienced years of violence in the Kivu conflict. And that means that on a daily basis, he was presented with anxiety that very few of us will ever have to endure. I know some of you watching this will have endured it, and I cannot extend the sympathy and empathy that would be required to heal any of that, because I just don't have the depth of it that is required to do what I've just suggested, because I can't comprehend the horror that people have been through in these situations. And when I try to extend that empathy, I think it misses the mark. I just have to acknowledge I cannot understand it, because I have had such a lucky life in the Western world. In spite of the trauma I might have experienced, it's nothing in comparison. And to grow up in such conflict means that on a daily basis, nothing feels safe. And you have to get to a place where you just accept that. But it's going to create trauma. It's going to create emotional, psychological, and of course at times physical wounds as well. Now, Patrick's father, Peter Lyoya, he actually sold Primus beer and clothes between Bukavu in the east and also the neighbouring country of Burundi. He was helped with his wife, Dorothy. So they're a team and they're doing the best. And they're trying to make a life for their child and children in spite of the environment that is completely challenging and that most of us would deeply struggle with. Now, on one return trip from Burundi, rebels attacked Dorothy. And they don't just attack her, they raped her. Now, I'm going to be clear, unfortunately, Dorothy is one of many women and girls who were sexually assaulted in the Kivu conflict because for some bizarre reason, men rape where war is. It's as simple as that. We see it play out in all wars. It is harrowing. It is about power and domination. It's also about release for the men because they have no care or consideration for the victim. And therefore, all of that pent-up anger, rage, frustration, the bullying that they need to present to another so that they can cope with their own issues and trauma, as well as being people who are psychopathic who play into that because, of course, war attracts that kind of mentality as well. We see women ravaged in this way. Look, go back to the Vikings. The reason that we talk about raping and pillaging is because of those kind of assaults in territories. It's happened since the beginning of time. But it doesn't matter that it might be happening to people who you know. It doesn't matter that it might have affected many more women around you. It's you who goes through it. It's Dorothy who has to endure that on an individual level. So that's one enormous trauma for the family to experience, on top of what's been compounded already by the horrors that they're living in. And then their home ends up getting attacked by armed men who steal the family's money. So even when they're trying to make a life for themselves, it's being taken from them. Now, in 2003, Patrick and his family, and by the way, Patrick's age 7 at this moment in time, they flee to Malawi. His parents and 5 siblings are with him, obviously, and they live in this sprawling refugee camp in Zelika. Now, when they actually arrive there, 9,300 people live there. Now, they're mainly from the Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi. And I'm sure that you will all be aware of the conflicts in Rwanda, and Burundi has massive issues as well. They are escaping this horrendous conflict, both political and physical, because of the individuals who are literally coming to kill them. It is absolutely harrowing when you read about the historical realities that these societies have endured, and the fact that there are still people going around constantly murdering and raping innocent people because they feel that they have an entitlement based on their politics, for example. Now, by the time that Patrick's family actually leave that camp, the population there had more than doubled, which is evidence of the horrendous conflict that was going on. Nobody's going to a refugee camp because it's fun. They're incredibly challenging. They're quite hostile environments to live in. There's a hell of a lot of people, no privacy, and food is very short. Now, Peter Lyoya, the father in this case, said he was literally at that point given bamboo to build a house, and so he literally did that. And the refugees existed on rations of oil, legumes, and maize. But they worked hard, and you know what? They worked hard together, and this is about turning their hand to anything to survive. So they raised crops, including pumpkin, cassava, sweet potatoes. Obviously, they only had small plots, but the fact that they were doing that meant that they could provide for one another. And bear in mind, most people had absolutely no electricity. Education was minimal, it's not a priority, but that didn't mean they didn't try. Those who were teaching there would actually use the shade of a tree as a classroom. And in spite of all of that hardship, and at the same time, all of that resilience, because I think it's clear there is a real resilience in Patrick's family, he, as a child, recalls the fact that he and his friends tried to make the most of it. Patrick talked about the fact that they played sports, they talked to girls they were interested in, they listened to music, they played soccer, and actually Patrick was a striker, he was a good football player. And apparently he played songs by P Square and Diamond Platinums, and he even taught refugees from other nations dance moves he'd learnt back home. So again, in spite of this being very hostile in lots of ways, it was actually a community-oriented space where people tried their best to connect and get on. And what's really ironic is I'm telling this story about a place that, to all intents and purposes, hadn't been safe for him and his family. To all intents and purposes, had been very challenging, and yet they made the best of it. So you imagine that if suddenly the family are given this amazing opportunity to find safety in the USA, it's going to literally open the door to freedom and hope and opportunity, and of course, the foundation of security and safety that they dreamed of. And that's where that story should end, because Patrick and his family should have gone to the USA, and that should have played out the way I've just described. But stories that should be happy and have that kind of ending often fail to do so. The family are waiting, obviously, on the refugee camp. They're waiting to be moved to safety. No one, by the way, from that refugee camp gets to choose where or when they will go. They could be there for years, they could be there months, and they wouldn't get to actually elect to say, I want to go to the USA, the land of the free. It would be where you were going to be sent. If it's a safe place, you go in there. Now, one of Patrick's friends in the camp, a guy called Amani Rudodi, he said, the dream of many people is America. And Patrick's dream was America. And in June 2014, that dream comes true. And the family are moved to Lansing in Michigan. Now, Patrick's 18 at this point, and you can imagine that for him, he's thinking about potential now. He's thinking about making his family proud. He's thinking about the possibilities that America presents. But let me tell you, like anybody, when you have a fantasy in your mind, it rarely plays out in reality. When I think about the United States of America, and believe me, I do, it's one of the countries that I genuinely would have loved to have gone and lived. But to actually get to America, it's really challenging on a visa level, even working visas. And I've looked at doing it, and it's kind of got a lot of obstacles, including things like the cost of health, because you have to be insured for a hell of a lot of money. And there are a lot of boundaries that are difficult to overcome. And essentially, when you think about all of that, you think more on the reality front than you do on the fantasy front. Because if I think about America when I was a kid, it was the Breakfast Club and the Rat Pack and baseball games and just this sense of the wonder of how big everything felt. And then I went and I traveled there for a period of time. I ended up staying in New Orleans for the most part because, with respect, I could walk around New Orleans. I didn't need a car because you get there and it's a different world. I love it. And I love the American people. But it's actually really expensive to sustain yourself, and it's challenging if you're not a resident there who's got a green card, or at least has got a scenario where they have been brought up there and have contacts, etc. So what you actually imagine in your head and then what you are presented with is very different when you're there. And I think for Patrick, he will have had all of those ideas about freedom, all of those ideas about possibility in the American dream. And then suddenly you're in America and it's so different culturally. It's so different food-wise, it's so different expense-wise. You haven't got the same community that you had been so used to when he was living in the refugee camp. Now, it's described where they actually moved as a miniature United Nations because there are a lot of refugees in that area. On one level, that's great because it gives some shared experience when we are surrounded by people who genuinely connect with us because they have, like us, been through some really challenging times. That can create bonds. But it can also be compounded trauma. People around you all suffering and struggling with the same experiences, the same losses, the same pain. And sometimes that can make you feel quite trapped. So on a psychological basis, it can be both conflicting and comforting. Now, Patrick and his mother end up signing a lease in Lansing for $708 a month. And on Facebook, it said that he attended the nearby school. He's not actually mentioned in the yearbook, though, not that I could discover anyway. Within a year, it turns out Patrick left his family and actually moved to the Grand Rapids area. Now, that area had taken in thousands of Congolese refugees. Specifically, he ends up moving to Kentwood, which is southeast on the edge of the city. But even though he's going out on his own and he's starting an independent life, he still goes home to his family on the weekends. He wants to help his brothers, help his sisters. He was basically the eldest sibling. He took that role very seriously. And I think that it's really important to acknowledge that because, as I said, when I talk about this, I'm going to be very honest about Patrick and some of his actions, which aren't positive. But clearly, there is a root within him of real care, real compassion, real love for the people that created him and have shared his life. His parents also said he was a really good son. Whenever he got money, he offered them financial support. So he never wavered in his connection, relationship, or support of his family. They're from the Malawi refugee camp. And at that point, Patrick is the first person to visit them. And he actually took them 2 Android phones and a pepperoni pizza from Little Caesars. And I just love that. Could you get any more American? I appreciate that some people will be like, Emma, pizza is not American. But I'm like, whenever I think about pizza, I'm either in Italy or New York. I don't know why. It's probably the gangster movies that I used to watch. But essentially, I love that. I love the idea of just going around with 2 Android phones, which is so Western, isn't it? It's so American, that communication, that connection. We're always on our phones. And a pepperoni pizza, just that sense of welcome to America. Gabe, at this point, was 19. And he said that he actually ended up practicing hairdressing on Patrick. He said the thing about Patrick was he was a really cool guy. He was just really giving, a very giving man. Now, like I've said, Patrick had some issues. So we're not going to paint him as a perfect pro-social human being because he wasn't. He'd been through a hell of a lot by the time he arrived in America. And those wounds had collateral damage and caused collateral damage with respect. So in August 2015, when he's 19, he's actually charged with driving while drunk, which is absolutely reprehensible. Nobody should get into a car and drive after having a drink. It goes without saying, you can kill people and yourself. He also then failed to appear at 3 subsequent hearings. and he ends up getting arrested more than a dozen times. But most of those, to be fair, are misdemeanors involving cars. Also, he does get 3 charges for domestic violence, which is horrible. That includes a 2017 case in which a police officer said he was highly intoxicated. But we're not going to remove the responsibility and accountability there. The fact that he's being charged with domestic violence is despicable, and it says something about his nature which is not positive. He was actually fined large amounts of money. He did stints in jail. These ranged from a few days to a month. And the substance abuse and alcohol assessments ended up being ordered twice. The results weren't actually made public though. So obviously they felt that he had some real dependency issues. And up until his death in 2022, Patrick's English wasn't great. So even though he was in America, he was struggling with the actual adaptation of the language. And when he was in court, he actually requested a Swahili interpreter for all of those court hearings, and rightfully so, because you need to understand what's being said about you. Now, I'm not going to minimise those charges. I'm not going to minimise the fact that he was found guilty of things that are really serious. That says that he had a problem with dependency and a problem with violence. I'm also going to note that when you come from a very violent environment, a very violent experience, a very different culture, then the adapting to a completely new and, of course, less tolerant society where violence is concerned, it's going to be something that you may struggle with. That does not minimise those actions. It certainly does not excuse them, but it gives us a license to understand where those wounds began and how those fractures can amplify in stressful situations. And I would imagine that moving to a whole new country, trying to go out on your own, struggling financially and all the things that go with it is going to be an exacerbator of stress. Now, Daniel Burns, who was his defence lawyer who represented Patrick in an early case, he actually said that the first time he met him was in the lobby of the Kentwood District Court. And he said what really struck him about Patrick, in spite of all the things that I've just said, was that he came across as a really sincere and really hardworking person. And he actually said this: he presents with an innocence. I think it's the language. He takes his time to respond, to make sure he's calculating everything, understanding everything correctly. Now, one of the problems, of course, is that the misdemeanors involved driving for the most part, and that meant that he lost his driving license. And in spite of that, Patrick continued driving. Again, that is completely wrong. I also acknowledge that America is very challenging without a car. If you're living in America, in the most part, you need a vehicle to get around. I'm sure that a lot of people who live in the States will be saying, I use public transport, I get it, but that's expensive as well. It's probably cheaper with the price of fuel in the States to actually drive your car. So the actual option of getting in a car and going from A to B is probably very alluring for Patrick, even though it means that he's breaking the law. And like I said, I don't want to minimise any of his actions. It's wrong what he's doing. But I also want to remind you, his mother was raped. Many women were raped. They were robbed back in their homeland, and nothing actually happened to those individuals doing these heinous actions. So his spectrum for acceptability where crime is concerned is probably very different to yours or mine. He probably sees driving a car as not really a big deal, whether you've got a license or otherwise. And so that mindset really is counterproductive to his experience in the States, because he's doing something that we take really seriously, but that he probably doesn't think is a big deal. And he borrowed multiple cars. So he borrowed a silver Chrysler, a white Honda, a blue Jeep, a black Ford. He just wanted to be able to get to where he wanted to go. And he worked. His jobs were factory gigs. And when he filled out a court form in the mid-2016, he was struggling really with his literacy quite a lot. He misspelled both his apartment street name. He misspelled his employer. He actually called it Mondale Service, which doesn't actually exist. So again, he's obviously struggling just to communicate in America because he hasn't got a grasp fully of the written and spoken word. But he did write down on those court documents that he earned $320 a week. Then in 2018, he's working at a turkey processing plant, but he did actually leave there after a co-worker stabbed him in the stomach. He literally went to work and got stabbed in the stomach. So understandably, after all the trauma he'd gone through outside of the States, you don't expect to go to work, a place that should be safe for you, and end up getting badly injured. And most recently, he'd actually worked as an auto parts manufacturer. So clearly he's doing his best He wants to succeed. There have been problems. Obviously, the criminal past is problematic as well, but he's trying at least to bring in money so that he can have a better life for himself. Now, in August 2020, he actually wrote on Facebook that he wanted to stop messing up as the firstborn son. So he obviously has this deep sense of responsibility to his family and also an understandable sense of guilt that he isn't coming up with the goods, he isn't coming through for them. Now, by this point, it's also worth noting he'd fathered 2 daughters by then. So he's probably starting to think about the fact that he needs to start being more responsible. His parents have stayed together through thick and thin. His parents have actually been in a scenario of high-level stress, and they have stuck together, and they brought he and his 5 siblings up the best that they could. So his blueprint for family is strong, and he's failing that blueprint. Now, just before I go into the details of actually what played out leading to the death of Patrick, I want to talk about the Grand Rapids Police Department. I'm going to refer to it as the GRPD, because it's had a lot of criticism, and I mean it's had national criticism, because people who've investigated, and from the outside looking in, from the public's perspective, the brutality the police have been engaged in is high. So in separate incidents in 2017, police officers actually aimed their weapons at 5 unarmed black preteen and teenage boys. Who would do that? You're a grown-ass man, you're a grown-ass woman, you're dealing with kids who are unarmed, and you think that aiming your weapon at them is acceptable? Of course that isn't. That's over the top, beyond belief. And it says something really unprofessional about that individual who's doing it, and also that that person cannot manage stress, and you shouldn't be a police officer with a gun if you can't manage altercations with kids. Then they actually handcuffed an 11-year-old black girl in a case of mistaken identity. She's 11. What are you doing handcuffing a child of that age? It's ludicrous. Also, in a 2017 traffic study, it showed that black motorists in Grand Rapids were twice as likely to be pulled over as white drivers. So for years, basically, advocates have complained to police leaders that traffic stops are often used as some kind of pretext for looking for evidence of more serious crimes. So they believe that they unfairly target black drivers. So basically what they're saying is that often these stops are used as a pretext for looking for evidence of more serious crimes. So they're unfairly targeting black drivers. And I've actually watched a series of judges who are obviously trying to fight back around this, who bring people into court, and those individuals are stood before them. And when you hear what they have been pulled over for, they should never have been pulled over. It's as simple as that. And it has absolutely been used to try to figure out whether they've got cannabis on them, for example. And these judges throw those cases out, and it is quite wondrous and great to see. But it also highlights that it can be really challenging for black men in particular in certain environments and areas, because there is this bias that is driven towards them regarding them being seen as criminals. Now, Robert Womack, who is the county commissioner in Kent County and chair of the governor's Black Leadership Advisory Council, said, "We talk to them, the brass, like they have cotton in their ears or bubblegum or something. They do not listen." So essentially they're saying, we're advising them what to do, but nothing is actually getting through, and these issues are continuing to be a problem. Now, the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, they've apparently received dozens of complaints regarding the GRPD, and they've been called to investigate possible racial discrimination. Now, investigations with the GRPD began in 2019, but the department has actually put them on hold because they said there's a lack of resources and staff. And apparently, there has still been a lot of controversial incidents involving GRPD officers. For example, 2 Latino boys were approached at gunpoint and they were handcuffed for walking in the road. I've actually seen another case where a guy was arrested for crossing the road in the wrong place. Also, in September 2021, a black man was arrested at gunpoint while preparing for the wake of his mother-in-law. And the reason that he was arrested, not just stopped and questioned, just arrested fully, it was because he matched the description of a different suspect. All of those that I've just talked about, the officers were not disciplined in these matters. So the fact that poor guy gets arrested and misses his mother-in-law's wake in a case of mistaken identity is irrelevant. No one got into trouble for it. And if you don't have any consequences, you're not going to change the behaviour. Now, it's worth noting that Grand Rapids is the second largest city in Michigan. It has a population of around 200,000. It's actually also the childhood home of Breonna Taylor, who became a national symbol in protest against police violence because she was killed by Louisville officers in March 2020. And there's actually been a downtown street named after her called Breonna Taylor Way. And it's worth noting as well that in that population of 200,000, around 18% of the city's residents are indeed black. So let's, with that in mind, talk about Christopher Schurr, the perpetrator in this situation, the police officer who is there to serve and protect. So Grand Rapids is also the home of Officer Christopher Schurr. Now, just before Schurr's 7th birthday, his family basically moved to a subdivision at the city's edge. Later, his mum, who was a legal assistant at a mortgage company, and his father, who worked at a trucking business, divorced, but they shared custody of Schurr and his younger sister, and they seemed to do that appropriately. He went to high school in Byron Center. It's a suburb of 5,800 people, and Schurr apparently was quite a gifted pole vaulter. So he was somebody who stood out for all the right reasons at school. He began dating Brandy Bryn, 2 grades below him, and then he graduated in 2009. So to all intents and purposes, he had a relatively nice education. And yes, there was some destabilization in the family with the divorce, but nothing that scarred him too greatly. Now, Ryan Lucas, who's 1 year older than Schurr, actually helped recruit him to Siena Heights University. This is where he pursued a degree in criminal justice, so he's obviously quite academic. And Ryan said that Schurr was the kind of athletic individual that had this promise that could genuinely make him a team leader. His former teammates, however, said that's all well and good in certain areas. He was gifted in a lot of ways. But when it came down to leading a team, the thing that really got in the way of Schurr was his temper. So if you were one of his teammates and he did not think that you were performing, you would get shouted at. So if they're doing training runs, he wouldn't encourage them. He wouldn't be somebody who was reassuring. He wouldn't try and bring the best out of them. He'd just basically tell them they were doing really badly and scream in their face. Now, Zacchaeus Widner, who's a former teammate, he said when the pressure came, he would freak out, like punch walls or snap pole vault sticks. He had high expectations for himself to succeed. And he said that really he felt that his temperament was something that made him not suited to be a police officer as opposed to suited to be one. Because as a police officer, you need to know how to deal with stressful events very regularly, because you're going to go through a lot of very stressful events. And in those moments where everything is just running at a high temperature, you gotta stay cool, calm, and collected, or terrible things can happen to you, and of course, in this case, to others. It's also worth noting that Schurr was also extremely religious. Now, that can mean that people are quite rigid in their belief systems. I think that having faith is an amazing thing, and I have deep faith myself. But I also know that there are some individuals who have a deep conviction in their religion, and they just don't know how to be flexible. It just means that they are challenging to be around because they can't listen to another person's point of view. They are right, this is the only way, and nothing that you say or do or discuss will even mean that they can meet you on that ground. They just have that inflexible mindset. He attended Corinth Reformed and Evangelical Church, and he actually later went with his girlfriend on Christian missions to southwestern Kenya. In fact, in July 2014, he went to the village of Kawati. That's actually described as literally one of the poorest and most devastated areas that has been affected by HIV and AIDS. And Schurr did God's work and did amazing work. So helped to build houses for widows, played with orphans, really got to know the community. And villagers actually called him Okabe, which means large-hearted. And while he and his childhood sweetheart Brandy were there, they got married. And the ceremony was officiated by Pastor Alicia. And they even exchanged rings of woven grass. And I do think that's really important to note. Because like I said, I want to be able to be nuanced, I want to be able to give you the information, and I also want to be able to talk truthfully about the character of the perpetrator. Now, what I've just described is a man and his partner going to try to help the poorest communities in black communities in other parts of the world, that he felt such a part of that community that he even got married there. He was officiated by a black pastor. So this does not reek of a man who is highly racist. And the reason I'm going to say that is because I think it's very easy when somebody kills a black person to automatically say this is racially motivated per se. I think that's got no nuance within it, and I think it betrays what we need to understand further about why people act in certain ways in certain situations. So he was doing good work in communities ravaged by HIV and AIDS, and he was literally trying his best to bring the community into a better situation, and he was well loved and liked by that community. Now, in 2015, after he's done this missionary work, he joins the GRPD, and he was really effective. He received multiple commendations by police department leaders for even chasing suspects on foot. So he'll put himself in the line of fire, he'll put himself in danger to, as far as he's concerned, do the right thing where the law is concerned. So his career's doing well. And when you think about his background, this is a guy who obviously has a hell of a lot of pro-social motivation and wants to do his best for society. But everything changes on the 4th of April 2022. So two friends of Patrick wake him up early in the morning. They want a ride to downtown Grand Rapids. Bear in mind, Patrick is not allowed to drive a car at this point. Now, after dropping one of his friends off, Patrick and the other friend go to buy some beer. Now, Gabe, who's with him, later confesses that there were open beer cans and bottles in the vehicle. And at this point, the two of them are actually discussing Patrick starting a barbershop business. So Patrick's obviously thinking ahead about how to improve his life and also to deal with that guilt he's feeling about not having succeeded as he wished he should have for his family. Now, shortly after 8 a.m. in the morning, a dashcam video shows Schurr, who at this point is driving alone, passing a Nissan Altima. Now, that car is being driven by Patrick, and obviously Schurr is in his patrol car. Schurr at this point pulls into the driveway of a nearby house, turns around, and then begins to follow Patrick's vehicle for a few streets before actually pulling him over. Now, Gabe said that Patrick was literally already pulling over as actually their car was experiencing engine problems, so he never had any other intention than to stop the vehicle. Now, GRPD records show that Schurr called in the traffic stop at Griggs Street Southeast and Nelson Avenue Southeast at 8:11 a.m. Now, the reason that Schurr pulled Patrick over was that he had an improper vehicle registration. So its license plates were registered to a different vehicle, basically. Now, Patrick's got some issues, hasn't he? He's on probation. And bear in mind, his driving license has been revoked. And that had happened most recently on the 20th of March 2022. This is following his third substance abuse conviction in 10 years. Also, he had 3 active warrants for his arrest. So this is not ideal for Patrick that has been pulled over. He knows where it's going to go if he's essentially apprehended. Now, those 3 active warrants included a traffic accident that happened on Christmas Day, 2021. Apparently, Patrick fled the scene. He also failed to appear at a court hearing, and there was a domestic violence warrant that had been issued just 3 days earlier after the mother of one of Patrick's children accused him of punching her and smashing her face into a car in a dispute over bed sheets. So understandably for Patrick, things are hot out there on a legal level. Now, the video footage shows Patrick exiting the vehicle. He does actually ignore Schurr's order to stay inside the car, so you can hear that Patrick's mind is whirring at this point. You know, you should always do what a police officer tells you to do. He then says to the police officer, "What did I do wrong?" And he kind of looks a little bit confused when Schurr asks him for his driver's license, but I think he's just trying to think about, how am I going to deal with this? How am I going to avoid getting into trouble? Schurr at this point asks him if he speaks English. Patrick confirms that he does. Then he tells the police officer, "My license is inside the car." So he opens the driver's side door. And it is strange when you watch it. You know, he's standing there for about 30 seconds. He's talking to his friend inside the car, but he doesn't actually go back into the car and he doesn't get the driving license. And then sadly, and it is sadly, because if he just accepted that he was banged to rights in that moment, if he just accepted that, yeah, I'm going to get brought in because I've got these warrants out. Yes, I've been driving without a license and I'm going to get into trouble for that. Everything would have had a different outcome. But the truth is, Patrick decides on a different route. He closes the door and then he just begins to walk away from Schurr. And Schurr's not going to have that. He's an officer of the law. He's already told this guy that he needs to see his license. He's got an idea that there is something untoward happening and he wants to apprehend this particular individual. So Schurr attempts to grab Patrick's arm and then Patrick starts to run away. But I will tell you now from the footage you'll have seen, it's not like he's a sprinter. It's not like he's running at such a fast pace that I couldn't potentially have grabbed him. He just seems quite lazy in the way he starts to run. It's almost like he knows he shouldn't be doing it, but he just does it anyway. Now at 8:13 a.m., Schurr calls for backup, and again, he's chasing Patrick, he tackles Patrick, and Schurr's just repeatedly saying, stop resisting. And he says that several times, and I would say that even though Patrick is resisting to some degree, he's not resisting highly violently. He obviously doesn't wish any harm to Schurr. He's not trying to be physically very violent to him. It seems more of a scenario where Patrick is just accepting that he doesn't want to be in this situation. He doesn't want the officer to be manhandling him. He's not enjoying that experience, as nobody would, but he's not trying to resist in a way that's highly obvious. And Patrick's a big guy. You can imagine if he wanted to do you some damage, he really could. Now, at one point, Patrick actually responds, okay. And he does that a few times. His hands are behind his back, and they're both on the floor at this point. Now, Schurr then pulls out his taser gun. He aims it at Patrick. And I completely understand that in that moment, Patrick pushes it away from his body because it's a survival instinct. No one wants to get tasered by anybody. So essentially, that natural instinct to just push the taser away is something that takes place. Schurr attempts to fire the laser twice, and it's Schurr's fault that it misses both times, but you can imagine now we're escalating in temperature and Patrick's probably feeling a threat. Now, in a video taken by Patrick's friend, Schurr and Patrick are basically both grasping for the taser during the incident, but it's clear that Patrick just doesn't want to be tasered and he's trying to get it away. It's not as if he's trying to get Schurr tasered instead. I can see in this video that essentially Patrick knows there are boundaries when it comes down to police officers, and what he's doing is wrong, but he's certainly not trying to create a scenario where the officer is genuinely feeling that threat. He's, yes, being an awkward person in this situation, and he should just stop resisting full stop. But he's not, like I said, being highly violent to the police officer. Now, Patrick's attempting to push it to the ground, this taser away from his body. And Patrick says to Schurr, stop what you were doing, please. His friend's saying, stop, you don't have to do all that. You can talk to him. And I think that is absolutely correct. Listen, no one is going to get away from this situation as a perpetrator. Whatever happens, Patrick will be caught for what has happened. Even if he gets away, even if the police officer lets him go, at the end of the day, his friend is there, they have the car, they have a description. There is no way that Patrick's going to get away with this. And his friend is trying to beseech the actual police officer to just acknowledge that this is okay. There is nothing really high level happening here and it can be dealt with in a far less escalatory way. But that struggle for the taser lasted around 90 seconds. And it actually ends with Patrick lying face down on the ground. Schurr is on top of him and his chest is pressed against Patrick's back. Schurr then shouts for Patrick to drop the taser or to let go of the taser multiple times. But as you know, Patrick is trying to prevent himself being tasered. Then approximately at 8:16 a.m., Schurr draws his gun, presses it to the back of Patrick's head, and shoots him. Now, you've seen the videos. Did that look like a situation where Schurr needed to use lethal force on Patrick? Does Patrick look like somebody who's so violent, so out of his mind, so dangerous that Schurr's life is in danger? Because to me, it certainly didn't. Then at 8:16 a.m, Schurr radios in the shooting and includes that the suspect was down. But bear in mind, he's been shot in the back of the head. I mean, you're not going to have a positive outcome from that, are you? That is lethal force in every description of what we'd imagine lethal force would be. Now, Chief Winstrom, apparently they'd only taken over the GRPD in March 2022. They subsequently had to confirm that Patrick had been shot in the back of the head and that he was also unaware of any weapons that had been recovered other than Schurr's gun and taser. Also, Schurr's body camera had actually been deactivated. It wasn't broken, it came back on shortly afterwards, but during that lethal altercation, it was deactivated. That could have been in the struggle. It could have been more purposeful, who knows? Now, he also confirmed that Schurr's police car was equipped with an automatic license plate reader, but actually didn't know whether it had been used or if Schurr was aware of Patrick's criminal history. GRPD records do include documentation of officers responding to the scene. One officer wrote that a witness said Patrick had taken Schurr's taser and said, "Your officer, he did all the right shit. He did everything he could to de-escalate the situation." And that witness, who said he was getting his phone from his house when the shot was fired, later said that he had changed his opinion on whether the shooting was justified after he'd actually viewed the video footage of the killing, and said that Schurr, as far as he could see, always had the upper hand. Now, understandably, for Patrick's family, this is the worst thing that could have ever happened to them. They have survived the most inhospitable experiences in their lives. They have come to America for a better life, and now they're dealing with the loss of their son, their eldest child. Now, Lyola's family and their interpreter, Pastor Israel Siku, they're later shown that footage of the incident at a Michigan State Police office, and they said, "Our son was killed execution style," and he was, with respect. Now, Pastor Siku actually told his congregation, "I saw the video. I could not sleep. The boy was on the floor. The cop, as he lays on him, pulls up the gun and shoots him in the head. Patrick did not move. So he's shot at a point where he's not even resisting." Siku also translated a statement from Patrick's father. Patrick's dad said this: "I witnessed this thing in Africa. I never expected to see it happen in America." The family also demanded that the footage be released to the public immediately. Also, they wanted an open autopsy. They wanted public identification of Officer Schurr, and that a Swahili language translator be present when they were met with the authorities. So they said, "We want nothing hidden. We want this investigation to be entirely transparent. We want the world to know what happened to our son Patrick." In Lansing, the Lyoya family held a vigil at the epicenter of worship. At this point, Pastor Sean Holland said, "For it was on Good Friday that a man named Jesus was illegally arrested and murdered at the hands of the state. But 3 days later, justice. There will be a resurrection." So the metaphor used there is, of course, Patrick's not coming back, but there will be justice that gives him legacy. Now, attorney Benjamin Crump, he worked with the families of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor. He actually represented Patrick's family, so we've got a hard hitter here. He also, like Patrick's family, demanded the prompt release of any video footage. And as I've said, there was a public outcry. So on the 9th of April 2022, there was a march held in Southeast Grand Rapids, and Pastor Siku gathered individuals to watch two men reenact the struggle that led to Patrick's death. On the 12th of April, a Grand Rapids City Commission meeting was held. More than 100 protesters, organised by the Royal Black Panther Party, marched outside, and there were chants from demonstrators that were heard in the council chambers, and that's 9 stories high, so you can imagine the tensions that were running high within that community, and understandably, that was for a very good reason. This man had been murdered in cold blood as far as they were concerned, and that footage got released. So Michigan State Police then opened an investigation. Of course, there were multiple videos of the incident, from a police dash cam, body cam video, doorbell video, and actually the phone recording from Patrick's friend. So all of those got released during a press conference on the 13th of April. Now, the investigation, when completed, went to Kent County Prosecutor Chris Becker, and they were the person who was responsible for deciding whether to charge Schurr. Now, Becker stated that while the videos were important evidence, they are not all the evidence. So they actually chose not immediately to press charges. They wanted to wait for the investigation to conclude, which makes sense. You have to have all the information to make an informed decision. Grand Rapids residents, though, they responded to the public release of the videos. So hundreds of protesters gathered in the downtown area and outside the GRPD headquarters. Those protests literally were daily. And as I've already noted, on the 16th of April, the largest protest was organised by the Royal Black Panther Party. And leaders of that march did encourage everyone to keep the demonstration peaceful. But some people in the crowd did carry assault rifles. And as the march approached the Van Andel Arena, authorities ended up blocking the area because there was a Kid Rock concert going on. So after night fell, some of the protesters actually attempted to enter the Amway Grand Plaza Hotel around 9 p.m, but they end up getting redirected. The march moves on. 10 p.m, the march finishes, but then a small crowd gathered in the Rosa Parks circle and they just were dancing to music on the loudspeaker. And I would say that having looked into this particular protest, it was extremely peaceful on the whole. Now in Portland, Oregon, a march began in Peninsula Park at 9 p.m. Protesters there did apparently damage a coffee shop and 2 banks and 3 bus shelters. I will never understand why people do that in their own area. It's like you're just destroying your own community, but we see this happen regularly. We see protests turn into riots. And 2 police experts told The Times that while they couldn't make judgments about the officer's decision to shoot based only on the footage, they did question what had happened before that. They said that the officer had chosen to pursue without waiting for backup and also deployed a taser at close range, which is very rarely effective with respect, and of course runs counter to standard policing procedures because you shouldn't wait for backup and you shouldn't be tasering people by yourself. Now, Jeffrey Alpert, who's a criminologist at the University of South Carolina, they've researched high-risk police activities for decades. And he said that when Patrick got out of his car, instead of staying inside, it could, as far as the police officer is concerned, have indicated that he posed a threat or that he didn't basically understand the officer's instructions. So in response, Schurr, who's alone, he gets out of the squad car, speaks to him in a pretty verbally aggressive way, and then when Patrick tries to run, Schurr followed him on foot, which of course increases the likelihood of using force. So basically a cooking pot of possibility that's negative that played out because of those initial decisions made by Schurr to actually go after this guy on foot instead of waiting for backup. Now we get to the 22nd of April. Patrick's funeral at this point is held at the Renaissance Church of God in Christ. It was attended by nearly 1,000 people. His casket was draped with the flag of the Democratic Republic of Congo. The eulogy was given by Reverend Al Sharpton, and he actually noted that Patrick's death coincided with the 54th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King. Sharpton also demanded the release of Officer Schurr's name and said that those in the general public accused of crimes immediately have their background ridiculed while police are protected. Sharpton also demanded a federal investigation, made comparisons to the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, said, "We stand with President Biden for those victims in Ukraine, but they shot a young boy in the United States. From Ukraine to Grand Rapids, we must stand up for victims." We get to the 25th of May 2022. At this point, Joe Biden invites Patrick's family to the White House to be presented for the signing of the George Floyd executive order. Now, when the official autopsy was conducted, one of the things that Patrick's family did was to hire the infamous Dr. Werner Spitz to perform a second independent autopsy. They wanted to be clear that no corruption could play out in the death of their child. Now, that decision was made before the results of the official autopsy were released, and Spitz reported that Patrick was killed by a single gunshot from a gun pressed to the back of his skull, which is dreadful. That really is an execution without a doubt. Prior to his death, it was also noted that Patrick had a predicted life expectancy of 82 and could and should have lived a long and fruitful life. Now, on the 6th of May 2022, the official report from the Kent County Medical Examiner, Stephen Cole, was released. He also agreed with the cause of death, also said there were no other injuries or diseases present, said that Patrick had died with a blood alcohol level, however, of 0.29. That is more than 3 times the legal drink driving limit. So the drink driving limit is 0.08%. So he was doing something that was wrong at the time of his death, but certainly shouldn't have ended up being executed by a police officer. Now, before Kent County prosecutor Chris Becker had actually decided whether to press charges, it was discovered the local police union donated funds to Becker's campaign as the Republican candidate in 2016. Now, understandably, if some people think that's a conflict of interest, the police have actually donated to their campaign, and now they're deciding whether a police officer should be charged. In this case, they would have felt that potentially he would have been on the side of the police. So some call for Becker to recuse himself from the investigation, and County Commissioner Robert Womack described the funding of Becker's campaign as a conflict of interest. Attorneys who were representing Patrick's family, they argued that local prosecutors favouring police is a bias that exists everywhere. I'm sure we can all agree with that for the most part. And Becker actually refused to recuse himself. He said he didn't have a relationship with Patrick Lyoya or Christopher Schurr, and he felt neutral. Now, the legal scholar Mark Ostler, who looked at this, said that this decision was one of the problems with these cases that are handled locally. Now, the Grand Rapids Association of Pastors, on the 1st of June 2022, they actually presented a document signed by 70 local pastors and spiritual leaders calling for a Justice Sunday to be held on Pentecost Sunday, the 5th of June. They also listed several demands. So they wanted a recusal of Becker. They wanted a federal investigation of the incident and the behaviour of the GRPD. They wanted public participation in GRPD union negotiations and ending the impunity of GRPD officers. They wanted increased funding and resources for the Grand Rapids Civilians Appeal Board, and the GRPD respect the freedom of speech during public protest against Patrick's death without implementing intimidation or violence. Now, on the 9th of June 2022, Becker did file a charge of second-degree murder. Now, this suggests that Patrick's death was intentional and was not committed in self-defense. Becker said, "This is not a message. This is just based on the facts and making a decision in this case. I think it's a fact of the world. Police officers aren't above the law." Now, Becker said he did not believe manslaughter applied to the murder. He said there was no heat of passion apparent in Schurr's actions. With respect, some people will disagree with that. Some people will say it was a very heated situation and that Schurr was believing he was at risk. But nonetheless, when Becker has looked at it, he does not agree with that. Now, that means that Becker is going to prosecute Schurr himself. And at this point, Schurr's name was finally released to the public. So Schurr then turns himself into the authorities in Battle Creek, that's 65 miles from Grand Rapids, and he was at this point held in Calhoun County Jail. Now, the aftermath of this has been enormous. So Professor Mark Dotson from Western Michigan University Cooley Law School said Becker's charges were significant on a number of different levels. He said, "I think there is sufficient evidence to support the second-degree charge, and I think he should be able to carry that burden if it eventually goes to trial." Now, the same day those charges were filed, Chief Winstrom demanded the city manager of Grand Rapids to immediately suspend Schurr's wages while the decision to fire him was pending. And on the 10th of June 2022, Schurr was officially fired from the GRPD after he waived his right to a discharge hearing. Now, of course, Schurr's attorneys see things very differently. So Mark Dodge and Matthew Bagula, they stated that the incident was not murder, but an unfortunate tragedy resulting from a highly volatile situation. And the Grand Rapids chapter of the Fraternal Order of Police defended Schurr's actions. They said the charges against him were ridiculous miscarriage of justice. Benjamin Crump, however, said that the charges were more than appropriate. There was a preliminary hearing on the 27th of October 2022 that was to determine if Schurr would face trial for second-degree murder. At this point, Judge Nicholas Ayub presided over this, and in Michigan, the legal threshold for second-degree murder is low, so basically probable cause is sufficient. Now, an engineer from Axon Enterprise, they were also brought in to discuss the taser situation, and they said the taser could still have been functional if pressed against someone, so basically saying you could have still used the taser, you didn't need to shoot him in the head. Then they brought in Sergeant Nicholas Kalati from the GRPD, and they said that when the police arrived at the scene, the taser was located near Patrick's hands, so they're kind of evidencing that Patrick was probably trying to get the taser, I suppose trying to defend, therefore, Schurr's actions. We get to the 31st of October 2022. At this point, Judge Ayub ruled that Schurr would indeed face a jury trial. They said that he knew he was pointing the gun and firing it at close range at the back of Patrick's head. And therefore, this judge said the trial should determine if Schurr's actions were justified under law. Now, Schurr, of course, and his team challenged that decision, but the Michigan Court of Appeals and the Michigan Supreme Court both affirmed Judge Ayub's ruling. So now we get to the 12th of December 2024. This is after numerous failed attempts to appeal the decision. A trial date was finally announced, and the jury selection is set to begin on the 21st of April 2025. Schurr's trial will then begin on the 28th of April 2025. Now, Ben Johnson, the lawyer representing Lyoya family, they said, after countless efforts to delay the pursuit of justice, Christopher Schurr is finally set to face his criminal trial this April. For the Lyoya family, this long-awaited court date is not just about seeking justice for Patrick Lyoya, but also about shedding light on excessive force by law enforcement. The Lyoyas remain steadfast in their commitment to ensuring Patrick's voice is heard and are determined to honour his memory as they prepare for their day in court. So, in spite of those appeals, which basically they were trying to get thrown out so the trial would not have gone ahead, the idea that he'd used reasonable force and he was in fear for his life, what the appeals court decided was that you have to have a standard. You have to have an acknowledgement that police can't always just kill because they feel that they have a right to kill. It goes beyond their duties, beyond their job, and it goes into a criminal scenario. And because of that, they're going to go ahead with the trial and let a jury decide whether Schurr's actions were appropriate or whether indeed he killed a man who essentially was defenseless in that moment. I'd love to know your thoughts on this. Do you feel that Officer Schurr is entitled to his use of gun? Or do you feel that he overstepped the mark? Do you feel that this was indeed racist? Or do you feel that Schurr would have acted this way full stop, no matter what colour or creed you were? Personally, for me, I think Schurr would have acted that way. I genuinely do. I think those rigid beliefs about what's right and wrong are probably so embedded in his head that as far as he is concerned, somebody resisting arrest has breached the scenario to a point where he can use excessive force and he can use force that is fatal. And I genuinely think that he would have done the same no matter whether he was dealing with a black guy, a white guy, a Hispanic guy, a Chinese guy. But everybody will think differently. Some of you will think this is racially motivated. Some of you will think that it's irrelevant that he was on missions helping people in Africa. Others of you will probably be more sympathetic to that belief that he is just somebody who overstepped the mark because he felt he had a right to do so because he's a police officer and it really didn't matter who the perpetrator was. If he was not doing what he said, well then he deserved to have his head blown off essentially. Let me know your thoughts as ever. It's one of those that, like I said, has probably caused some conflict. Like I said, I really struggle with police officers killing anybody. I think it should be a last resort and there should be a really good reason, and I really can't find one in this case. But do you think that Officer Schurr should go to prison for the rest of his natural life potentially? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you again next time, guys. Be safe.